Hello everyone, it has been a while. The most significant event that occurred while I was absent was of course the war in the Ukraine, which started in February of this year. A much more minor event occurred on the 30th of August. The death of Mikhail Gorbachev, the last General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Now, in my view, Gorbachev dying during a war between two former Soviet republics was quite appropriate, since I argued that his misrule led to this situation. Indeed, he was one of the worst leaders of the 20th century. With only a short amount of time, he managed to destroy the Soviet economy, caused a massive fall in living standards, completely destroyed a superpower, breaking it up into often far weaker republics, and doomed world communism. It was thanks to Gorbachev's stupidity that NATO was able to add numerous former Eastern Bloc countries and Soviet republics to their alliance. The collapse of the USSR also led to severe economic hardship in Cuba and North Korea, which both became much more isolated and poor. Now, fascists, conservatives and liberals claimed that this was all due to the fact that communism does not work. They of course forget to mention that the USSR only collapsed when Gorbachev started implementing pro-capitalist market reforms, something that has been heavily documented, as I shall explain. When Gorbachev came to power in 1985, the Soviet economy did face some real problems. The Brezhnev administration did nothing to upgrade the Soviet Union system of planning and focused on military spending rather than improving economic infrastructure and health standards. One of their most infamous disasters was the refusal to fund the OGAS system that would have greatly upgraded Soviet planning via the use of computing and cybernetics. The Soviet economy would have been connected to a national computer network, which would have allowed for far more efficient and widespread planning. When this policy was proposed, this technology terrified the Americans. To quote a Kennedy official, "By 1970, the USSR may have a radically new production technology, involving total enterprises or complexes of industries managed by closed-loop feedback control employing self-teaching computers. If the American negligence of cybernetics continues," he concluded, "we are finished." However, instead, that policy was abandoned in favor of the status quo, the same system used since the Stalin era. Now, in the 30s, 40s and 50s, the system was effective. However, by the 60s, it started to become obsolete. The Soviet leadership seemed to do nothing to mitigate this. So Gorbachev did not inherit a great economy. He inherited an economy in need for reform. However, Gorbachev's chosen solutions actually destroyed the Soviet economy completely. Gorbachev, who clearly was not a communist, chose to implement market reforms, perestroika, a form of market socialism. Two terrible reforms stand out: the 1987 law on state enterprise and the 1988 law of cooperatives. The law of enterprises gave state-owned companies control over their own finance and revenue. The result of this policy was disastrous. According to the Brazilian economic historian Numa Mazat, this policy directly led to the undermining of the economic plan, funds being diverted from investment, and deepening shortages. It also saw a return to large-scale unemployment, with 1.6 million Soviet workers losing their jobs between 1987 and 1989. Then there was the law of cooperatives, a disastrous policy that led to the first signs of oligarchy in the Soviet Union. The law established a private sector where so-called co-ops could ignore the Soviet economic plan and operate according to capitalist motives. According to Mazat, these co-ops, usually started by Soviet managers, bought goods made by their own state-owned enterprises at low state-controlled prices, processed them at their co-ops with little or no alteration, and then sold them at a much higher price to the public. For example, in state stores, the price of detergent was no more than 62 cents. In some co-ops, the price of detergent was $9. So these co-ops were buying up all the cheap products in state-owned stores and then selling them at a massive markup. Disgusting price gouging like this was one of the leading causes of shortages. It also created a capitalist class that would greatly benefit from Yeltsin's even more disastrous capitalist reforms. It should be remembered, Gorbachev clearly laid out the groundwork for Yeltsin's future shock therapy and a transition from a socialist to a capitalist economy. Now, when Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, the anti-communists in the West were delighted. He was clearly their number one choice.
We needed to try to search out the people who would guide the Soviet Union after Brezhnev, after Andropov. And looking around, there were about 2 or 3 possible people in terms of age and seniority. We dispatched invitations to all 3. It was pure chance that Gorbachev was the one who accepted first. When Gorbachev came to the United Kingdom, he indeed brought his wife, and that was one of the first signs that we were dealing with someone quite different. Soviet leaders very, very rarely travelled with their wives anywhere.
I'm cautiously optimistic. I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together. We both believe in our own political systems. He firmly believes in his, I firmly believe in mine. We're never going to change one another.
March 1985. Konstantin Chernenko was dead. At his funeral, world leaders paid their respects to Mikhail Gorbachev and weighed up the new, younger man in charge of the Soviet Union.
George Bush was there. As vice president, he was head of our delegation. When we walked out of that meeting, I said to George, I said, "This is a very different Soviet leader than any we've seen before."
It was clear that they thought Gorbachev would be a pushover, and they were right. Gorbachev was not only an economic incompetent, but also showed no interest in helping other socialist states.
Communist leaders like East Germany's Erich Honecker relied on Soviet support to stay in power.
To imagine that the Soviet Union, after 40 years of alliances, would leave every socialist country to fend for itself and turn its back on them as if there had never been a brotherly community. This was unheard of.
So no one should be surprised that the Soviet Union collapsed under this charlatan. He was a liberal, an utter incompetent who was totally unfit to be General Secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR. Despite witnessing the terror these anti-communists brought to the world, he was willing to grovel before them. And where did it get him in the end? Doing ads for Pizza Hut and being despised by his own people. And he well and truly deserved this contempt. Between 1990 and 1994, under his successor Yeltsin, the mortality rate rose by 33% in Russia, leading to the death of millions. Now naturally, being a failed man, Gorbachev spent his last years full of bitterness and regret. He cursed the West and defended Putin. Of course, Russia is now in a miserable state, an oligarchic, authoritarian conservative dictatorship with a weak economy and a declining population. It is interesting to note that anti-communist Russian nationalists like Dugin and Solzhenitsyn were horrified when they got what they wanted. The anti-communists were utterly wrong about everything, a warning from history. Now some of you may be wondering why I have been gone for so long. One reason, I now work full-time. Since I am new to such activity, it took me a while to organize my time correctly, more than 2 years in fact. I was always really tired when I came home and just wanted to rest on the weekends. However, I think I am over that now. I feel the main reason has been my state of mind. I was quite depressed at the state of the world, which really left me without any energy. So a lack of production was due to a lack of both physical and emotional energy. However, in the last few months, things have started to improve. Left-wing victories in Latin America, the removal of the conservative government in my country, the massive industrial action in Britain and America, things are starting to look a bit brighter. I have also come to the conclusion that I should stop taking myself so seriously. Instead, I should try to have fun on YouTube rather than pretend to be a great intellectual, which I am not. So I am looking forward to the next year where I hope to massively increase production.